Thank you very much to you and Mordechai, and welcome everybody to the morning shir in Chassidut, based on the Pirkei Avot, which the Talmud itself calls it Mili, the Chassidut, words of Chassidut. Yesterday, we started to learn the fifth Mishna of Perek Daled, chapter 4. We are going to continue what we started yesterday in the second half of the Mishnah. We talked about the Torah, that we're not allowed to make out of the Torah a quote-unquote crown. We're not allowed to make of the Torah, we're not allowed to have any benefit from learning. We say that the Torah, when we learn the Torah, we're not allowed to derive any benefit whatsoever from the Torah, not spiritual benefit to be considered an important person, and not a materialistic benefit, which means to be paid for the purpose of learning Torah. Now, the Rambam explains this point at great length. When the Rambam, in his interpretation, in his commentary for the Pirkei Avot, the Rambam actually has an interpretation, a commentary for the entire Mishnah. And he explains the great prohibition of not being able to receive parnasa, livelihood, from learning Torah. He also talks about people, he talks about how bad it is to learn Torah all day and to have to rely on the community for parnasa. He also writes about this in the Yad HaChazaka. Others say that you are allowed to receive money, parnasa, and payments from learning Torah. So the Alter Rebbe finds over here a middle path. He says when the Mishnah tells us, when the Torah tells us that we're not allowed to derive and receive parnasa, livelihood, from learning Torah, that means that you can't start learning Torah for the purpose of a benefit from it. But if a person learned L'Shem Shamayim for the sake of Hashem, and then he says, you know what, I need to have parnasa, so then he's allowed to utilize his knowledge of the Torah to receive parnasa. That it fits in very well with what the Rambam says. And on one hand, you cannot rely on Torah for your parnasa, for your livelihood. But on the other hand, you can't be dependent on the community. And as the Alter Rebbe explains, because if a person will not have what to eat, he's going to need to rely on the community. The Alter Rebbe explains this, elaborates upon this in 2 points. First of all, he says you're allowed to have parnasa from learning Torah, because if not, you have to learn a special. Profession, and then you won't be able to learn Torah because you have to learn the profession. So the parnasa is for the purpose of learning Torah. It's not a separate subject. It's for that purpose. Number 2, there's a difference between something that you plan to begin with. In Hebrew, it's called lechatchila. Also in halacha, it's called lechatchila, plan A. And then you have di'evet, if it's done already. So what are you supposed to do? You have to find a way how to survive. So it's true that in the beginning, you're not allowed to learn in order to receive parnasa. But if a person learned properly, and you need to have parnasa, so you can use that for your parnasa, but ultimately the parnasa is for the learning Torah. So it goes 2 ways. Here's an example for this in halacha. You're not allowed to go out on a cruise or on a boat 3 days before Shabbos, because then it will bring about Chilul Shabbos. But if a person already went out, he wasn't planning to go out for Shabbos, and then he realizes he's not going to get back on time, so he's allowed to continue on his way on Shabbos as well because of Pikuach Nefesh. It's saving a life. Otherwise, you're going to remain out there in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the ocean, and that would be terrible. According to this, we could explain what Rabbi Nehorai says in the Tractate Kiddushin. That he said he's leaving all of the professions in the world alone, and he's going to teach his son only Torah. So you could ask a question. We know that the Talmud tells us in Kiddushin that you have to teach your son a profession. So how did Rabbi Nehorai bring his son to the state that he'll have to make the Torah into something that he'll have to gain money from, earn money from? So the answer is, according to what we said earlier, especially according to the explanation of the Rebbe, we can understand. In the beginning, when he's teaching his son, he still doesn't need to have parnasa because he's living by his parents' home. And afterwards, when he will grow older, he will be able to have parnasa from the Torah that he learned. Even though his father knew in advance that his son is going to have parnasa one day. But just like you're allowed to go out on the boat within 3 days before Shabbos, even though he knows that afterwards he's not going to be able to be back on time, perhaps. So he doesn't have to worry that he's going to putting himself in a situation of a plan B, and that's okay. So as we are a couple of days before the receiving of the Torah, we should give a bracha that we should all be able to dedicate our lives more and more to the learning of Torah. We are grateful, thanks to Raya and Mordechai, that we have many shiurim of Torah, not only at Chabad, but also that we're able to give people the opportunity to learn Torah from our YouTube channel with nearly 820 videos. And Bezrat Hashem, we should be able to continue and build up the YouTube channel and build up our Torah learning in person at Chabad of Rechavia right here in Yerushalayim. Thank you so much for joining us.